Mary, wherever you are. Thank you for inviting me to join in this conversation. Good morning to everyone. I'm pleased to be here. As Ellie said, we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about how to fill the gap of unmet medical needs. I grant you, it's a gigantic topic, and we are going to try to trim it down just a little bit into two areas. The first being broad-scale health threats, how unmet needs are challenged in that arena in terms of things like obesity, the opioid epidemic, etc. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we're going to look at the diseases that are so rare that sometimes they have neglected areas of research. The goal is to look at what's happening, what needs to happen to overcome some of the challenges. But as Mark just did, I'm going to start on the positive, on the upbeat, and talk about potential successes and imagined possibilities. And for that, I turn first to you, Bob. You told a journalist this summer that the opioid epidemic is the most serious health crisis facing the country at the moment. So I would ask you, in a realistic world, not in an imagined world, but in a realistic world, what would success look like if we moved the needle on that epidemic?
Well, I do want to emphasize that the opioid epidemic and truthfully the drug overdose epidemic in America really, in my view, is the public health crisis of our time. 72,000 people died last year from drug overdose, 49,000 from opioids, but again, a significant number from amphetamines and other drug overdoses, largely driven by synthetic opioids, the fentanyl that is creeping into not only opioids, but is now being mixed with amphetamines. And some of you know it's personal to me because I almost lost one of my kids this way. Now success, for me, is going to come from a couple areas. First is I would ask people never underestimate the possible. Because right now, sometimes people don't think it looks too good. This is a big problem. Some of the things that I think is going to help us move to the success, clearly, is getting real-time data. I'm listening to the previous discussion, having come in, and when I came to CDC, I felt awkward when people were presenting me data about what things looked like in 2016. I said I didn't realize I was an historian. I said, could we get a little more current here? I'd like to see what's going on now. And I will say, as you heard the discussion about data, one of the first things that CDC did to try to help in this effort was to get the timing of our data. And one of the data sources that we have that we hadn't used before is medical records. And so now we've introduced this thing called syndromic surveillance, so that now, truthfully, states get the data on overdoses within 48 hours. So they get a better idea of where the overdoses are occurring, which is really an important thing to begin a response, to get an idea about where the epidemic is. Prescriptive drug monitoring program. Who would believe I just left West Virginia where I did a tour to see the epidemic up close and personal in an area of Charleston, Huntington, West Virginia, probably one of the hardest hit areas. 5% of all births in West Virginia are born to mothers. Those babies have neonatal addiction syndrome, 5%, right? In that area, there was certain towns that had 2 pharmacies, less than 1,000 people, but somehow those pharmacies sold 30 million oxycodone tablets. How does that happen? So now we have a prescriptive drug monitoring program that allows people to understand, doctors and pharmacists, who's getting prescriptions and how many they are, and red flag it. Obviously, we got to educate the American public, both physicians. I think we do have to take some responsibility of the 5th vital sign. Many of you may have had a procedure, surgical procedure, been in a hospital, and people are asking you for a pain score, pain score, pain score, pain score. I think that 5th vital sign was a mistake. I'd like the Surgeon General and I are going to probably write an article on the death of the 5th vital sign, because I think we have to reprogram the expectations for management of pain and educate the American public. You know, if you get a single prescription filled for an opioid, like your adolescent son or daughter has their wisdom teeth out, 2 to 6% of those individuals become chronically dependent. 2 to 6%. I don't think most physicians understood that. I sure don't think most parents did. So when you ask about what success is going to look like, I think there is a time, and I'm going to put the advocacy back into science, and I think you're going to hear from Francis Collin later in the third panel. Science is going to provide solutions to this, where we're going to have mechanisms to treat pain that are basically inert in terms of their positive feedback loops. Right now, I think success for us is to educate the physicians and nurses and nurse practitioners about prescription practices and look at alternatives for management of acute pain, which we're looking at alternatives for surgery that could be opioid free, so we don't necessarily start the next generation of opioid chronic users. On the other side, for those who have chronic pain, and 1 to 3 million people, we need to continue to provide care and treatment for those individuals, but be trying to look at developing alternatives that become, let's say, less addicting while we manage their pain. I do think that I say to people, in 1981, 82, 83, when I started my career in AIDS and all my patients were dying, I wasn't too sure that the power of science was really going to come through. It seemed pretty tough. And yet you look now today, if you have HIV infection, you live a natural lifetime. We have the tools to even end this epidemic in America, one of my aspirational goals as CDC director. So I'm confident that what's going to happen is there's going to be a progressive solution of alternatives to treat pain that are not addicting. Mm-hmm. And we will progressively begin to be much more aggressive about treating drug overdose. And I'll sort of close with this thought. If I come in with accelerated angina, or like the gentleman that mentioned in the last panel had multiple stents, if I had angina, came into an emergency room, that hospital system would not let me back on the streets until they had a path for treating my angina. You come into most emergency rooms in this country today, overdose from drugs, like near death, get brought back to life, you get discharged. There's no, try to find someone to get into a system. I can tell you in my own personal life, trying to get my own son, and I'm pretty connected, into a facility that was quality to get him basically in recovery, was an enormous Herculean effort, right? It shouldn't be that way. We need to basically have systems where people come in with a drug overdose, it's recognized, they're integrated into a care structure for recovery, and we need to get people to realize, like my son, success is the rule, not the exception, I think. So I don't know if it directly answered it, but I would end with never underestimating the possible. We are going to win the battle against opioid death and drug overdose. It's going to take time. It's going to take science. It's going to take a much more effective integrated health system to deal with effectively taking care of the young men and women that are struggling with addiction. And I sort of close with the recognition that we saw this in AIDS, that stigma is the enemy of public health. In the AIDS epidemic, stigma was a big deal. Let me tell you, my son was in tears. He was so stigmatized to tell his parents that he had a drug problem. And I tried to explain to him where his parents would love him. You shouldn't be embarrassed. We're here to help you. But just look at the word addict. Look at the word addiction. Just think of how many ways we stigmatize society about people that have a medical condition, as Secretary Azar would say. It's a medical condition. It's not a moral failing. And I think we need to comfort families like my own and give us the strength to stay together as a family as we strive for success, one human being at a time. So when you ask me about success, one human being at a time.
And just as a very, very quick follow-up, you mentioned 3 things that could mark success. One, that is the delivery of very timely surveillance data, a different way to treat pain, and better treatment programs. Is the first one delivering more current surveillance data? Are you at the finish line on that? Are you where you want to be? I know the other 2, it's quite a ways off.
We're not at the finish line, but we have a very good start now with what we call the syndromic surveillance system. Not to mention, I don't want to, we heard the other day, I mean, one of the challenges is to have data systems that are relational. When I took over CDC, I told them I didn't want to be an historian. I'd rather be predictive, use data to predict, not historical references. So data has to relate. So we're still in the process of moving, but I'd say most states now are getting the data
Okay.
within 48 hours.
Okay.
CDC is getting the data in a way that they're comfortable with, which we call curated, within a month. Well, when I started, it was 2 years.
Mm.
So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Okay.
And it's now being linked to correctional systems. So when there's a drug overdose or a police get something, there's linkage. So we can begin to start get a better map of what the response is. I think the most critical and thing that we really do need to recognize is that somehow between the Reagan administration and now, we dismantled our mental health system in America. I mean, most of the drug addiction that I see is really a lot of people that are self-medicating because they just don't get into that part of behavioral health. So when you really look at that issue, we're really beginning to rebuild that. I think that's really going to be the big effort. But I think that the data part, we're definitely, I'd say we're 75% of where we need to be.
Okay. So we're going to switch gears ever so slightly now. In our earlier conversations, almost everyone on this panel seemed to coalesce around the notion that collaboration is of utmost importance. And that was certainly reflected in the comments of the panel earlier today. So Celia, let me turn to you. You come from the evaluation and research perspectives. When you talk about collaboration, you sometimes point to efforts in the field of renal replacement therapy. What does that look like in practice, and why is that in particular a touchstone for you? What does it teach us about other ways of collaboration?
Well, first let me maybe say a little bit about what it's an example of and what, what has been going on in that area a bit. And so just to take a step back, if you look at the field of unmet needs, one large area is for patients who are on renal dialysis. So renal dialysis looks pretty much what it's looked like for many years, and patients get the same kind of treatment that they've received. And so in discussions with professionals in the area and also other colleagues at FDA, including both in the other medical product centers too, it's clear that we want to look at what could be done at this stage to try to advance treatment of that group of patients. And the problem is that there's not a neat, obvious solution or pathway, and it's not clear who would champion that pathway.
Is it considered a rare?
It is not a rare, I
Okay.
don't know. Well, the definition of rare disease, I don't know whether technically it would be
All right, keep
meet
going.
the rare disease
Yeah.
definition. But it's pretty common, I'd say, even if it's rare, so to speak. So it's an area where there's really a lot of need, and I think there's a lot of technology that could be developed, but there's not really a clear path for what would be needed, what would be accepted, what patients want, what would be paid for, how it would get reimbursed. So all those questions that would maybe prompt, and there's also a lot of unmet science needs in the renal replacement area. People have visions of, for example, developing actual replacement kidneys. That would be at one end of the technology solution, would be to develop a bioartificial kidney. But there's a lot of scientific questions that would have to be answered in order to develop that. So it's not an area that's ripe for a company to step in, develop a solution, implement it, and then done. So what is needed is the collaboration of a lot of different groups in the engineering area, in the biological sciences area, the clinical sciences, the patient groups, to talk about what's the goal, what are some of the iterative steps along the way that might lead to useful product for that patient population. So we at FDA, and then have done one thing, and then working with HHS has made another step, and I'll just summarize what those are. So the Kidney Health Initiative is a public-private partnership that is in conjunction with the American Society for Nephrology. And that group, the Kidney Health Initiative, with leadership from FDA and many other experts in the area, and also participation of patient groups, has developed a roadmap for renal replacement therapy. And it's meant to be not a roadmap of how you can get to the end, because there's so many steps that have to be done along the way, but it's a roadmap of all the different scientific efforts, as you might say, sub-steps that would need to be done to get to the goal of better treatment for that population of patients. So that effort, which really got quite a bit of public attention and traction in the community, and I think has inspired people to think about this area in a way that hasn't really been thought about before, led or maybe prompted another effort called the Kidney X Prize, which is another public-private partnership effort sponsored by or organized by HHS and the American Society of Nephrology to try to look at some of these steps along the way that would need to be accomplished and lay out prizes for some of these steps. So I've maybe described the effort, but now obviously this is just something that has just started out. But I think the importance of it is just recognizing the fact that renal replacement goal and even the sub-goals that might lead to improvements, even if they're not, the goal of a kidney replacement, it's an important effort, and it's not something that a company is going to achieve on its own. Mm-hmm. And it's not something that is, it doesn't have a home for who is going to develop it, because it's so complex, the science and all the different things that need to be done are so complicated that it really needs a community.
And do you think that this notion of it really needs a community is a model that could be replicated?
I think it's a model that could be replicated, and I think for some of these areas that are complex and have many different scientific components, and they are not going to be solved by one group alone, yes, I think so. I mean, NIH does a great job supporting the research too in this area. So I don't think this takes the place of NIH development research, mm-hmm. which is critical in any of these new medical technologies. But some of the issues like how it's going to be reimbursed or what the patients are working on, all those components are part of this project also. So I think it goes beyond basic science research. It's a little bit more of an applied project.
Okay. So you come from the science perspective. Adrian, you come from the consumer perspective. I think in the earlier panel you were identified as a disruptor, so welcome. And I took a look at your organization's website, and what I found very interesting, I think it was on the homepage, side by side, there were medical and community perspectives. Yeah. And I thought that was a very interesting visual representation of the need for collaboration. So in your piece of this, what does collaboration look like and what would success look like? And I should mention that your organization is devoted to what's considered a rare disease, sickle cell.
Well, first I want to say thank you for having me. And do I have this right? Am I okay? Okay. For those of you who don't know sickle cell, it is a genetic condition that evolved as a result of malaria. So what happens is, again, like in all genetic conditions, you have parents who have the trait, and you have two parents with the trait. They pass it on to the children, and you have a 1 in 4 chance of each pregnancy having a child that has the disease. And in America, we are the largest rare disease group. There are 100,000 of us, at least. We're counting now. We're getting a registry going. So it's unique in the sense that, well, there's so many of us, and those of us in America are, the majority are African Americans, and we carry with our disease our history of African Americans. And so we're sort of on the outside and yet part of the inside. I hope you understand what I'm saying by that. So collaboration for us is a very interesting thing. We historically were a very religious society, and so we did a lot of praying. My mother was very religious, and my brother had sickle cell. And so we did a lot of praying, and yet my mom would take me with her to the doctor's office to talk to the doctor, right? As if she didn't want the minister to know really what she was thinking, which is science is going to fix this. So I think collaboration went from me being my minister, family, minister, doctor, to being an greater understanding of what we really needed in order to have good care. For a long time, we thought we only needed to survive for a certain age. If we could get our children to live, then that would be some huge milestone. Not looking at really looking at our children as being just people, right, who had a condition that did not define them. So we started looking at it as the children survived, as not something we just had to get through and accept, but something that should and needed to have some input from the scientific community. And so a lot of it came out of, and people don't know this, but actually it was the Black Panthers who brought this up, that you need to look at this, and we need to have some voice, and we need to have, we need to be seen. And so our children, again, began to live, and we started thinking, well, we can live past being children, you know, what else can we get here? And as we started finding our voice and working with hematologists, pediatric hematologists, when we got the handoff to adults and the adults started having real problems, we started blaming the adult hematologists. So it became clear that, our community needed to reach out now and work with the adult hematologists. So it sort of kept growing and growing. And every now and then we would have a company come to us and say, we're looking at sickle cell and we want to do clinical trials. We had much resistance to clinical trials, again, due to our historical perspective. So we're kind of like, again, in and out at the same time. We know we need this. We know we need a voice. We know there are possibilities, but are they really going to treat us as equals? Are we really going to have a voice? And what we learned from that was looking really truly at the AIDS population and saying, how did they do that? All right? Because they were the first large disease group that had been stigmatized like we had been stigmatized. But for us, it had been part of us historically. For them, they didn't have the visibility. They had prior to that an opportunity to be part of the mainstream. So we were looking and we were like, oh, okay. So those moms are knocking down the doors and saying, hear us. And those loved ones are knocking down the doors and saying, hear us. And not only that, they're showing up, and they're showing up at meetings. And they're showing up and they're speaking with politicians. And they're going and they're like marching in the streets. Well, we aren't quite marching in the streets. But what we did do, we were able to reach out to like ASH, the Society for Hematology. We started having meetings and going to meetings at NIH. We started talking in small groups about the need to be a part of trials and understand what good science was. And that's actually how I got involved, was I was waiting for stem cells because I understood what my daughter needed. And I started this journey just from my daughter and me. I mean, I was fifth generation of mothers in my family to have a child with sickle cell disease. And I had the potential of being a grandmother of yet another generation. And so I was waiting for stem cells because they were going to cure it at that point, thinking that we didn't have many options for treatment. So for us, we were going to go just to the cure. And I discovered a group called the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And the thing was that in their model for funding, they built in collaboration. So it was the first time I ever saw truly what collaboration meant. So they have research scientists, they have medical doctors, they have a patient advocate like myself, someone who lives with that disease. They have a mountain of other types of researchers, data analysts, and we sit down together and we design the protocols for the trial. So I was able to say, no, you can't have people with sickle cell come and go to the university 3 days a week in Los Angeles. I mean, you can't, they're exhausted. And they kept saying, but what about the pain? And I'm like, well, you don't know about the exhaustion. So we were able to design a trial. We were able to look at the psychosocial needs for families. We were able to, I was saying, who's going to pay for the parking? Who's going to pay for the gas? How are we going to do these things? And we designed this trial, and everybody has to do that. If you want the money, you have to collaborate. So that was something that was really new for me. So collaboration to me is everybody at the table who is involved in our treatment, involved in our research, or in our care, is at the table from the beginning giving parity.
Thank you. It's so interesting you bring up ACT UP, which is what I think you were referring to back in the day in the 80s. They were seen as so radical in the moment. And yet, I can't tell you the number of patient advocates I talk to now who hearken back to that and use it as the model to emulate. Anyway, Srini, way down there. You're in the rare disease field of drug development. How does collaboration change what you do and help you in this field of meeting the unmet needs? What difference does it make?
Yeah, so before I begin, thanks so much for having us here and giving us this floor, and Mary in particular, and to my fellow panelists. So Horizon is fundamentally, it's committed to putting the patient needs, at the forefront, understanding what the challenges of the patients are, and then through that lens, try to deliver breakthrough therapies. So it's important for us to understand this because understanding the patient perspective and their challenges and rare disease go very much hand in hand. So a couple of examples that I can quote for you where Horizon's been able to participate and influence the whole collaboration process is a key component to understanding better therapies for patients is understanding the natural history of the disease. And in order to do that, we actually need to create a system where this information can be collected. So Horizon partnered with the North American Pediatric Renal Trials and Collaborative Studies to essentially develop the first longitudinal cystinosis natural history for patient registry. And the purpose of this registry is really, the registry is really owned by the medical community. And it's really to understand and gather data, which in the setting of a rare disease frequently comes in disparate bits and pieces, and to be able to synthesize it and then and evaluate it to see how better we can actually glean information about these patients and therefore how to better take care of them. So that's one example of that. A second component is really understanding the role of diagnosis itself. So in rare disease, typically a patient goes through maybe about 7 different physicians that they see, and over 5 years from the time of onset of symptoms to the point where they actually get effectively diagnosed. That's a really long time. And by the time you're able to do that, the disease has kind of evolved and you're playing catch up the whole time. And it's also hard to find a good specialist to be able to, to care for these patients. And on the flip side, there are over 7,000 rare diseases, and we can't expect all of the specialists and the physicians to be conversant in all of them. And so, we really had to come up with a different way of addressing how we think about diagnosis. And the Children's National Rare Disease Institute exactly tried to get at that. So their goal, and they are a first of its kind rare disease center of excellence for the North American Rare Disease Association. And their remit is really to bring in a panel of experts who can understand and evaluate and essentially shorten the burden it is for the all too familiar lengthy process of diagnosis, as well as the struggles that the patient's families have to deal with. And Horizon supported that in one of its initiatives And we worked with developing a clinical care setting that consisted of kind of genetic counselors, dietitians, social workers, and other doctors. Bring them together to be able to, and all of these folks specialize in managing children who have rare diseases. So when we think about collaboration, internally in our organization, we always have the motto of, all of us are better than any one of us. And we really try to espouse that as we interact with the external community as well, as we think about, how to better administer therapies. Again, for us, just understanding what the patient is going through and understanding that journey really is already an integrative process. We have to go through many streams of
Yes.
communities to get that. And then we work from there to actually try to see internally how do we better collaborate to come up with better therapies.
Thank you. So we're going to move from rare disease to the larger scale health threats. Gary Cohen, let's focus for a moment on antimicrobial resistance. When you think about collaboration in part, you think of it in an interesting and realistic way as a safety issue, that safe antibiotic practices have to be adhered to while in tandem science is pursuing new antibiotics and vaccines. So how does collaboration help ensure that those two tracks are happening?
Well, thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Research America. Everything we're doing in this area relies on collaboration. Before I talk about how we're collaborating, I'm going to characterize the problem. And I don't normally talk in superlatives, but I'm going to do so for a moment. I would regard three major threats to the health and well-being of the world's population exist today. One would be widespread nuclear war. The second would be climate change, for those of us who believe in climate change. I'm one of them. And the third is antimicrobial resistance. And that's not well understood, because increasingly what's happening is drugs that we rely on to cure infection are no longer working. And to put the scope on the problem, there's about 700,000 people globally now who die from resistant infections. And that's projected to grow to 10 million by the year 2050, which would make AMR a greater cause of death than cancer or diabetes. And I can tell you the investment in research in AMR is a tiny fraction of those two areas. But when you talk in big numbers, you can glaze over. So let me tell three quick stories. Tatiana Vargas, a 26-year-old newlywed, goes to Hawaii on her honeymoon, comes back not feeling well, diagnosed with strep, treated inappropriately because she was not diagnosed properly. It was a syndromic diagnosis, observational, and put on a broad-spectrum antibiotic, ends up in the ICU battling for her life. She's discharged, back in the ICU battling for her life again. Why? Improper diagnosis, improper treatment. If you have a resistant infection, in her case MRSA, and you're treated with a broad-spectrum antibiotic, it'll kill off all your healthy bacteria. What will survive is the resistant infection, and it may be that the treatment itself puts you in the life-threatening situation. Or Peggy Lillis went to the dentist's office and due to the dental procedure and the existence of C. diff in that office, picked up C. diff, died, and her sons now have an advocacy organization. Or Rory Staunton, 12 years old, got cut on a basketball court at school, ended up with sepsis but misdiagnosed, and died 4 days later. His parents started an advocacy group. I have permission to tell these stories because they're collaborating with us. So among the problems here is that I think it's understood there's almost no new antimicrobials in the development pipeline. It's a dry pipeline. It's a failed market model. You have some companies working on it. Many more have backed out. So what does that tell you? You have to keep the existing drugs working as long as possible. We're not a drug company. We're a device and diagnostics company. And that area is very relevant because how can you keep the drugs working as long as possible? Limit the spread through good infection prevention and control and hygiene, and ensure proper diagnosis. The term antimicrobial stewardship refers to proper use of drugs. You cannot practice that unless you have an accurate diagnosis, know whether or not it's a resistant infection, and know what will work. You can do that with diagnostics. But I can say that diagnostics have been the Cinderella, not invited to the ball here. For many years, the discussion was really only around the development of the new drug pipeline. And it's very important, by the way. But given that it's nearly dry, you have to put more emphasis on the proper use of diagnostics, both in primary care, where you can screen for whether it's a viral or bacterial infection. Today, you can do a rapid flu test about the same as a mid-sized Starbucks drink. You can do a rapid flu test. Only 2 countries in the world are using them at any scale, the US and Japan. And about 30 to 50% of prescriptions in primary care of antibiotics are unnecessary because it's not going to be effective. It's a viral infection. And then in hospitals, you have the issue of the misuse of broad-spectrum antibiotics and also the complexity of hospitals not adjusting therapy even after a diagnosis is obtained. So that's the scope of the problem. In terms of collaboration, if you thought I was exaggerating and saying this is one of the greatest threats to the world, the UN General Assembly in September 2016 at their highest level meeting of the year spent an entire day with heads of state on antimicrobial resistance. And the governance group for that is called the Interagency Coordinating Group, commissioned by WHO and the Secretary General's office. They've set 5 goals in their strategic plan. One is awareness and education, surveillance and research, infection prevention, optimal use, which is antimicrobial stewardship, and innovation. We're working on collaborating in each of those areas, including taking responsibility for mobilizing a coalition of people globally who are calling themselves resistance fighters, antimicrobial resistance fighters. And it spans from the world leaders in this space right down to patients and clinicians and advocacy organizations all participating in this campaign, which is not a commercial campaign. Doesn't have the BD logo. It's antimicrobial resistance fighters. On surveillance and research, we're collaborating with many organizations, I'd say most notably CDC. By the way, the gentleman sitting to my right leads an agency that is an absolute gem in our national security, the Centers for Disease Control. I work closely with the CDC over many years. It costs so much less to prevent problems than it does to deal with them after they happen. And CDC is doing groundbreaking work in this area. We're providing data from a data system. The first panel today was about data. We're sharing data with CDC and other organizations on reporting. I'll make this quick because there's a lot of collaboration. There's a gentleman named Adams sitting here. He met this morning with the Society for Healthcare Epidemiology, a collaboration we're doing on training on infection prevention and control. On diagnostics, we're collaborating with the US government through CDC and through USAID and through PEPFAR to strengthen laboratory systems to improve the ability to diagnose multiple drug-resistant TB. TB is responsible for 1/3 of resistant deaths today. And that's just a subset of the collaboration we're doing. This problem cannot be solved by any one sector. And collaboration is in fact built into our business model of how we're going to help address and combat antimicrobial resistance. And there's a concept called shared value creation, that if you do good for society, it'll be good for your organization. And we very much believe in that concept, and that's what we're applying here. I could spend a lot more time on it, on other collaborations, but let me stop
Not
there.
with me as moderator. I couldn't even tell you.
All right, well, I did so voluntarily.
Thank you very much, Gary. Willie, I turn to you now. I would say we talk a lot about prevention, but I don't think of prevention in the context of an unmet medical need. However, you do. So provide us a little bit of a framework for that kind of thinking.
Sure. Thank you, Jackie, and thank you to Mary. I feel honored to be part of such a distinguished group. I want to circle back to something Dr. Redfield said earlier about the fact that we don't pay that much attention to behavioral health. And in fact, if we look at the leading causes of death in the United States, including but not limited to cardiovascular disease and to cancer, they are all linked to behavioral risk factors, whether it be smoking, whether it be lack of physical activity, whether it be poor diet. So really, it's really important to think about prevention very broadly when we think of unmet medical need. I think that a lot of work has been done in this area. We now have a menu of tools by which we can prevent substance abuse, by which we can prevent STIs, by which we can promote physical activity. But I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done. And so some of that unmet need has to do with how do we take what we know and scale it up. So earlier, I think Dr. Benjamin was speaking about the importance of implementation science. And I think that this is an area where, at least in behavioral health, is significantly further behind. So if we have a patient that comes in with cardiovascular disease, we likely know a series of tools that we're going to do with that particular patient. And on the other hand, in behavioral health, if we have an adolescent who's experimenting with drug abuse, whether he or she's embedded in the school system, we don't know exactly what to do because oftentimes we don't take evidence-based interventions and implement them into these existing systems, whether it be school systems, whether it be in the community, whether it be primary care settings, etc. And so we really have to think about what works and how do we take it to scale? How do we take it to scale? How do we take it into the communities where these interventions can really have an impact? And I'm talking about not just scaling out, but also scaling up, but also scaling out. So taking behavioral health interventions that have been found to be effective in one setting, say for example in schools, and integrate it into other settings that perhaps may be a little less stigmatizing, such as primary care. And that's something that I don't think that we tend to do a very good job at. The other thing we've been talking a lot about partnerships, and this is very, I think, just as important, if not more important, when you're working on primary prevention. In order to get these communities, in order to get these interventions into communities where they can have an impact, it's important to get the buy-in from a lot of different key stakeholders.
Yep.
It's important to have the champions in the community who are the school teachers, who are the parents, who are advocacy groups, physicians, and government leaders, because otherwise we're not going to be able to implement this successfully in these communities.
Thank you so much. And Michael, finally, I'm sorry you had to wait so long. You were at this conference last year. I heard some of your remarks, and one of the things you said was we're at a crossroads for innovation to go from testing to applications, but it's important to break down silos. In the context of unmet medical needs, what have you seen in the past year where silos were broken down?
Thank you very much. So I'll share a few thoughts on how we approach unmet medical need. And I got really, stimulated by the viewpoint from the panelists. And I hope I'll also provide some hopes for the future by tagging on to some of the disease challenges we have by exemplifying products in the pipeline of our company and similar, possibly in other peer companies that could provide that solution. So first of all, when we look at disease challenge and how to address unmet medical need, we try to look at solutions, approaches, science that breaks down the barriers to prevent the disease. So you really want to either have a disease never to occur or secondary prevention, that the disease that is under management doesn't relapse in a progressive stage. The other thing is to look upon disease in remission, managing the disease, maybe even lifelong for a patient. And the third is to think about and even dream about curing disease. Now, when it comes to preventing disease, and I think Gary here spoke about antimicrobial resistance, we have embarked in a significant effort to look for vaccines that can deal with some of these most threatening bacteria, and work closely with the Celia Witten's FDA CBER division in getting advice how to develop those strategies in the most impactful manner. One example you mentioned was the patient with multi-resistant staph or MRSA that is at risk of succumbing. So we try to really analyze what is the different unique antigens, the things that are the fingerprints of Staph aureus, whether it's resistant to all antibiotics or a normal Staph aureus, and then created a 4-component vaccines that is now in large clinical studies. And if that type of vaccine is successful, it would have prevented that patient to really end up with that life-threatening infection. And you then had a story of the patient being exposed to broad-spectrum antibiotics and maybe succumbing in Clostridium difficile, which is a huge escalating problem because of the widespread prescription of antibiotics. So a second vaccine in this space we're working on is really to understand these toxins of this difficult bug, and we've been able to break down a lot of technical barriers, how to take these very difficult to make toxins and attenuate them and build them into a vaccine that again is in large clinical trials. So these were two glimpses of hope to patients that never needed to end up, if these products are successful in the hospital, or wouldn't have succumbed maybe to a broad spectrum antibiotic. Dr. Redfield spoke about the epidemics of opioid and addiction and the difficulties to deal with that. Under the name of prevention, I would say, on one hand, you want to take those patients off the dependency of opioids. But of course, they will relapse if they have pain, if there are no other medications. And one real exciting biological we're working on is an antibody against a protein that sensitizes the nerves for pain. The drug is called tanuzumab in late-stage clinical trials, and it would address about 50 million Americans that live with chronic lower back pain, osteoarthritis, and have tremendous pain. Early clinical results, some of it just recently from pretty large patient studies, shows optimism about this approach. Disease remission, managing patients, and we heard about the sickle cell patient. We have a significant program there, which was a partnership with a biotech company. And again, we wouldn't have been able to do it ourselves. We have to break down those silos of small companies and large companies. We're working with glycomimetics on a drug that really provide an opportunity when sickle cell patients are doing well, but get this crisis, tremendous pain, and they end up in hospital intensive care units. And what are physicians prescribing? Opioids. And they end up on opioids addiction. Now we have a drug that we showed in mid-stage trials can reduce dramatically the need for opioids and the pain in a very short moment. And that type of insight, how we can return them into remission, has now led us to embark on disease-modifying programs where we hope to treat patients so they never will get that crisis. And finally, from prevention, remission, I wanted to end on cure. And this is an area where we really need to break down barriers between technologies, medical need, and translating technologies into efficient use for large-scale patient studies. So we have been highly engaged in gene therapy for some time with a variety of different companies, and have looked how you do these experimental therapies in a much more consistent and reliable fashion. And it's been really stimulating to see in the last 5 years a number of gene therapies providing hopes to cure fatal hereditary diseases. To quote other companies, we saw the first approved gene therapy in the United States, Luxturna, for hereditary gene related to blindness, and that was approved recently. We have embarked on studies that now are ongoing for Duchenne's disease, where boys die young in age. And this was just a couple of examples how we need to break down barriers between technologies, application for human, and dreaming about cure.
I want to open it up to questions from the audience in a moment, but I'd like to go down the row and ask each of you a quick question. And I'm only giving you, think of this as speed dating. I'm going to give you each 15 seconds. I'm sorry, but that's what we have. And I want to ask if there was one change, you could wave a magic wand and make it happen in your field, whether it's regulatory, financial incentives, societal changes, what would that be to overcome the challenges in your fields? Thinking specifically of unmet needs. Bob, I'll start with you, 15 seconds. The clock is running.
Boy, one thing to change. I think the most important thing is to stimulate innovation. I think that there's a lot in the system right now that limits innovation, and even in our own field, in trying to advance public health. So I think if a lot of our work is less prescriptive,
Okay.
and allows us to have more innovation to pursue what we think needs to be pursued.
Celia?
Well, maybe this isn't a big enough answer, but I would really like to see more research aimed specifically at technology development, manufacturing technologies for manufacturing vaccines, gene therapies, and I think that would benefit those fields, and some of that would help across the board.
Thank you. Willie?
Would like to see wide dissemination of effective interventions and stop putting resources in interventions that do not work.
Mm-hmm.
And then second, I'd like to understand which type of interventions work for whom so that we can eliminate health disparities.
Great. Adrian?
I would like to see equal access to good care so that we can all take advantage of these new technologies that are coming down the pipeline.
align reimbursement and regulations to encourage use of diagnostics for the correct use of drugs to preserve the use of existing drugs?
So I would say even more bolder partnership. We have had great relationship with FDA, Celia's division, with CDC, but I think in light of this explosion of science and technology, we can do even more as an ecosystem and be able to accelerate some of these new medications, whether cell or gene therapy or some other transformative therapies, and coming together, agreeing about standards, about surrogate endpoints, about what data sets are required to get wider recommendations that facilitates earlier access. And I think that dialogue has really moved the needle the last few years, but we could maybe gain another 5 years by continuing and accelerating this dialogue.
Thank you. Trini.
I think in the context of rare diseases, I think it's primarily a better understanding of the natural history of the disease. I think if you look at a lot of progress that's happened in other areas where we've been able to capitalize on systems that the FDA and the technology explosion that's happened, it's really had to do with better understanding clinical endpoints and then being able to work with surrogate endpoints and biomarkers to be able to accelerate therapy. So I think in the context of rare diseases, understanding what a clinically meaningful, moving the needle means is a critical component. So the natural histories, the disease history will.
Interesting. Thank you. Questions? There are folks with mics, I think, on the other side of the room. Over here at table 8.
Thank you. My name is Katrina McDonald, and I'm a board member with the Sepsis Alliance. Sepsis is certainly one of these issues that is going to take collaboration to address. More than 250,000 Americans die every year, and if you develop sepsis, your likelihood of surviving without the loss of a limb diminishes by 8% every hour that your sepsis is not diagnosed and treated. And if you're a patient with other underlying health challenges, you don't even have that long. So we're grateful to partner with the CDC, which has begun a wonderful public education campaign with BD, because when somebody comes in with sepsis, we need to diagnose it quickly and figure out which antibiotics are going to address it. And Pfizer has been a terrific partner.
And the question?
So the question is, in Great Britain, a sepsis action plan was developed that within 2 years brought the death rate down substantially by identifying and planning collaborations. Dr. Redfield, I wonder what it would take to do a sepsis action plan in the United States.
Well, I know we appreciate the relationship and collaboration, and I want to say sepsis is a very important thing. And I think we at CDC are, continuing to review how we can try to accelerate the education and the systems that we put in place already, and see, if they need to be improved. Because as you know, rapid diagnosis of sepsis is the whole ballgame. And I know we've put some in. I've just started my 6th month. Obviously, after this question, I'll make sure I go back and really look exactly where we're at. Because I do believe that this is an area that we can help educate. And this is sometimes where standards really help improve outcomes. I mean, clearly I know they have, the sepsis protocols now being operationalized in every emergency room that I'm aware of, but be glad to look at them and look at it in comparison to what the UK has done to see. I know we've made progress, maybe not made as much progress as we need to make, but I know we've made progress, and I will look at those too. Look at the UK program and see if there's more to learn from there.
Is there a question on this side? Table 15. Mike is coming your way.
Thanks, Jackie. Susan Denser from the Network for Excellence in Health Innovation and the Research America Board. And I don't want Dr. Redfield to feel ganged up on, but this is another question for you, Doctor. I'm heartened to hear that you think we've made so much progress on data and information sharing around drug overdoses, because that is very important. But it does seem as if we've made much less progress on the prevention side of that. With the state PDMPs, which you mentioned, we know some of them have a 1-week requirement for filing the data that a patient has received a prescription, which is not very helpful in the case of a patient who might be, for example, doctor shopping. We know that only about 30% of opioid prescriptions are e-prescribed, which means we're not collecting a lot of automatic data that could be used very rapidly. So we have a long way to go. What are your ideas for attacking that particular end of the problem?
Well, I think you raised a really important part. I mean, clearly, the prescription drug monitoring program as implemented today is just a beginning, you know, and the complexities we have, because we award these through grants and contracts, not to get into the weeds, but, you know, when I want to get reporting done, say, in 48 hours, I want to know why I can't get it. Well, the contract says we're going to do it quarterly. So now we have to wait till next year's contract and try to make sure next year's contract is different. So I do think there are some changes coming that are going to accelerate communication, or this state won't share data with that state because the contract says the contractor who has that has a thing in the clause that they don't have to share it with the contractor that has the other. So I think
Silos.
this year we're definitely going to correct all those contracting issues, and we've had those discussions. Because the reality is, this is going to work. It's got to be available. It's got to be in real time. And you know, ideas, innovations that people have, we're very receptive to receive them. Not just me, but the entire department. This is a major priority for the secretary. As you know, you're going to have him here this afternoon. And clearly, we've got to get real-time information on those prescriptions in real time. We need to get the pharmacists to be able to have real-time. You know, one of the recent bills I know gave pharmacists the ability now that if they really suspect it's a fake prescription, they don't really need to fill it. We need to get much more vigilance, and there's only about 3 suppliers, I'm told, that supply everything to everybody. You know, we're trying to develop a couple things now. We're trying to develop sort of a system at CDC that would predict the amount of opioids that we think should be coming into a different region and start to monitor how much coming into a region. So we don't end up with a West Virginia that has 30 million tablets for a population less than basically 1,000 people. So I don't want to imply we're anywhere near the gold line on this, but I think the fact that we've started the prescription drug monitoring program, to continue to improve it, to look at other ways to measure how much opioids are coming into the system. But it is a double-edged sword. We just started a program called the Rapid Response Team that we're making available to state and territorial local health departments. Because when they close down a pill mill, okay, what happens? People then go in to get illicit drugs. And the illicit drugs are more likely to have amounts of fentanyl in it. So this is still very problematic. But if people out there have innovative ideas that we need to look at, there's a lot of procedural areas right now that need to be corrected, that are being corrected as we do the contract for FY19. But again, we're open to more, because I do think you're right. It has to be real-time available information.
Is there another question for another panelist?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Over
She said
here.
that because I talked too long, and she wants to get more questions.
Patricia Wu, C&M International. My question is for Dr. Dolston, Dr. Ramanathan, or others. I'm curious how you are thinking, if at all, about kind of newer players in the research space. Verily, 23andMe, others. How are your companies looking at either partnering with or the opportunities or challenges perhaps posed by these newer players?
I'm happy to start. I think for us, collaboration and really creating a very diverse ecosystem is key. And we'd love to see a way to stimulate the ecosystem to come together. And whether it's traditional biotech or these more information-oriented companies, we really need to create that network. And for example, we have had a collaboration with IBM on looking at sensors to understand patients and patients' behaviors, and the possibility of using big data to get much deeper insights into diseases. We've had numerous dialogues with companies like Verily and you know, how to use artificial intelligence on large data sets. And actually we collaborated with 23andMe to use their consumer genetics approach in getting insights about inflammatory diseases that allowed us hopefully to better then design clinical trials. So I think this is really a transformation where tech companies and biopharmaceutical companies are really entering into the same ecosystem.
Yeah, similar theme. So when we think about R&D, we think about what are the available tools and platforms and technologies that we can, that are out there that we can integrate for a different cause or for a different unmet need. So our approach to this topic really entails kind of a very holistic systems-based evaluation, right? So we use a lot of mechanistic models to actually think about are there metabolic pathways that can be mapped out? Are there immunological networks that can be mapped out? And then really integrate them and then determine, using that framework, are we in a position to better understand how to go about selecting a target? And so that's from a mechanistic perspective. And then again, working in the rare area, we have a real patient-based evidence that we generate. So we kind of look at both ends of the spectrum depending on how we can come at the problem. And then together we try to synthesize what is the best way to approach a particular disease or a particular target. And if nothing else, it allows us to probably search in a richer place than searching in a very abstract manner. And it kind of goes back to the cystinosis registry that I talked to you about. I mean, that information we're hoping will be very helpful for the medical community in understanding what the natural history of these patients is, and it's longitudinal. So I think to the point about collaboration, we really need to utilize all available technologies because there's so much progress happening and so many capacities that we have to be really open to absorbing all of these and then determining how best it serves the needs that we are working on.
We have time for one more quick question. Is there one on this side of the room? No. Is there one on that side of the room? Okay, we're done. I want to thank each of you for your good thoughts, your hopes, your aspirations. We appreciate it. And thank you again, Mary, for having us all.
Thank you.